In this video, we're going to be looking at what the comic seems to indicate regarding lockdown. Now, Asterix says to Obelix, who is busy complaining over here, that everybody is overtaking them. This is the start of the first stage, and he says to him, "Don't stress, it's a long race. There are lots of stages to get through. No point fretting, it's all about sportsmanship." In South Africa, there is a proposal by one of our political parties to implement these 4 stages rather than having the country locked up as we are right now. And it says here that stage 1 is going to be the least restrictive and stage 4 will be the most restrictive form of lockdown. Okay, so we see that in the comic it also says that, but it also says that it's going to be a long race. When I initially read this 2 weeks ago, I thought, well, they did say lockdown is going to be for at least 3 weeks and they might extend it. So that's where I think this comes into play. So lockdown will be for the entire pandemic, just in varying degrees of severity. Now that I have a better understanding of how these stages slot into the whole picture here, I thought let's have a look at what happens during these stages and what we can learn from that. Early on in the first stage, we see all the chariots heading toward an elderly couple who are traveling in the opposite direction. Now, even though everybody passed them by without causing harm to them, we notice that right after they have passed them, Dogmatix is gone. Obelix makes a stop, causing a huge crash, and they have a big fight as a consequence. Here we can see them heading off, and there's a heap of guys in the foreground. The one said, "Shouldn't you keep your distance?" This makes me think of social distance. Now we know how the virus will affect the old people, and they are definitely a concern and a threat to the rest of society in terms of getting the disease and spreading it, and that could certainly be captured by this incident over here. Then it says many Roman leagues later, this might indicate the extension of lockdown, but now they're not so sure where they are heading. And they ask this guy in his little boat here. He tells them, "Listen, you are in Venetian territory, we live on the water." And this guy tells them where they need to go. But they have this interesting conversation about the city that is busy sinking. And this guy says, "Listen, no, the lagoon's actually rising. The climate isn't what it used to be." So here's this climate change element that comes in. In this article, it talks a bit about the impact coronavirus is having on the world's climate. And they are saying that it's a very positive impact. It actually says, in Italy's Venice, meanwhile, canal water is so clear, fish can actually be seen. This article makes it clear that coronavirus is not due to climate change, but it goes on to say, the virus is a terrifying harbinger of future pandemics that will be brought about if climate change continues to deeply destabilize the natural world. So there's real concern about climate change, and this virus is actually a very positive thing for climate change and pursuing it. Now, I personally believe that we are messing up the environment, but I think a lot of what is said under climate change is simply not true because it's just being used to further a hidden agenda, and we'll see that come out in this comic. I believe the hidden agenda with climate change is to further the keeping of Sunday as a day of rest. I'm expecting this Sunday issue to pop up, and I have seen some of the articles that say shops are closing on this day, but this will become a very, very big issue in the near future. Here again, the Pope is seen in September of 2019. He urges politicians to take drastic measures on climate change. Now, certainly if he is behind the coronavirus pandemic, as the comic suggests with the Julius Caesar character, then he is busy using this climate change in this situation to further his own agenda. This comment of Asterix is very interesting. He says, "That was an odd detour, almost as if the Romans had messed with the signs." And then he says, "But that's not fair. They're vital," key word there. And he says, "I know, we can't cope without them." And he says, "It could have been the death of us." So I figured, let me go and look up these vital signs that they might be suggesting here. And remember, these signs in the comic are used to travel from point A to point B in these stages. Now, this article over here says, managing emerging infectious diseases, should travel be the 5th vital sign? it is time to add a fifth vital sign. A simple targeted travel history can help us. So here we have this vital sign spoken of in the comic. Remember to keep the bigger picture in mind, where this coronavirus, this crown virus, is about Caesar's crown and him enforcing his rule on the nations of the world. We will see something really interesting by the end of this first stage that will add to the bigger picture that Julius Caesar initially painted to Bifidus when he started out with this race. So right after they talk about these vital signs, then they reach the inn. And they only scored 1 point. And you can see here that their 1 point is being compared to coronavirus's 10 points. So it's almost like the message is being sent that, listen, with a stage 1 lockdown, you can't expect to beat this champion. You can't expect to turn the infection curve on this virus. Another thing that I'd like to point out when they reach the inn is that when you look at the context of our current situation with the pandemic and the stages of lockdown, you realize that when they reach the end of stage 1 and rest for the night, this is not indicating that there is a total abandonment of lockdown. It seems to just indicate that, listen, now there's a shift being made in the severity or the stage of lockdown. We are transitioning from the one to the other, and this will not necessarily be from stage 1 to stage 4. For instance, here in South Africa, we started with a stage 4 lockdown, and according to what I have seen in the second stage of this race, I'm expecting our country to slack measures a little bit and give us a lighter form of lockdown, only to have a big crisis on their hands as a consequence. The other reason why I say the stages of the lockdown will not be the same for everyone is because later in the comic we see the Cimbri, these guys over here, they are allowed to pass the roadblock in a later stage and everybody else is stopped. I have something really interesting to share about that as well. Now the charioteers can be seen chilling out and they start complaining about the terrible stage they went through. And this guy talks about an olive oil spill, and then he has an argument with somebody about the spill, accusing this chap as being guilty. And Asterix comes to the rescue. He basically knocks this guy out, and then he tells them, listen, we're not enemies, we're just adversaries, and we all have the same goal. We must prove to Caesar that we can beat his champion. So there's this unification theme that starts here, and it develops throughout the race. Remember that Julius Caesar said that the unity of the people are at stake if a Roman doesn't win this race. Now later that night, Asterix reveals something really interesting about this unification. Obelix says he hasn't seen that many Romans, and then Asterix tells him, listen, it's perfectly normal. There is more to Italy than Romans. And he makes a list of peoples, and he says, and Caesar is struggling to control them. So here we have the crown or the corona coming out again. This leader that is struggling to control certain people. So now I better understand Asterix's comment here, even though this is posed in a way that would make you think that they are trying to prove a point to Caesar. You'll see at the end that Caesar is hailed as their great leader, so they have succeeded in their goal. It was not just to prove a point to Caesar by beating coronavirus, but they have actually helped Caesar to regain control. And that's why this statement is so important. He is struggling to control them. So he is seconding what we have seen when Bifidus and Julius Caesar have had their first meeting, the off-the-record meeting. As I shared in the previous video, Julius Caesar represents the papal power, and we can see in Revelation that there is going to be a time when this papal power will recover from the deadly wound it received in 1798 when the Pope was exiled and all his civil power was taken away from him. We have this very interesting scene where this guy crows like a cock and then sets off the following stage. Now this only happens twice, at the start of the second stage and at the start of the fourth and final stage. So the cock only crows twice. Now this reminded me of Peter in the Bible when Jesus said to him, before the cock crows twice, you will have denied me 3 times. Now in the Catholic tradition, the Pope is seen as the successor of Peter, and therefore this crowing of the cock makes perfect sense, because before he crows twice, there are 3 stages that have already taken place.